Okay, so now what we have here is our front end with our create DAO button that simply creates the DAO with this hard-coded proposal. But of course, we want our function to take an argument, and we want that argument to be provided by the user rather than taking in a hard-coded value. So let's talk about how we can modify this DAO create application component to take in a user-defined proposal rather than a hard-coded proposal. So the first thing, I'm going to take a step back and kind of explain what exactly this code is doing for those not familiar with React. So what's happening here is this first active address. This is coming from use wallet, which is a library that allows us to connect to a wallet. And by default, we're just connecting to localnet. However, once we switch to testnet or mainnet, it will also allow us to connect to a bunch of other wallets in the Algorand ecosystem. And what this is basically saying is if there's an active address, then we want to render this component. So if we have our wallet connected, render the component, otherwise don't. And now the actual component we're rendering is defined here in DAO Create Application. So if we come here, we can see DAO Create Application is the name of our component, and its argument are what we call props or properties. So in these props, one of the things I've defined is a proposal that can be passed in. So here we're passing in the property proposal as this is a proposal, and that's what's getting used to create the application on chain. So now what I want to do is actually let me show how this works. So I'm going to go ahead, pop open my console, make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to make sure, yeah, all is connected. I'm going to hit create DAO. And we can now see here that we have created this application in this transaction. So I'm going to come back to here. I'm going to run algokit localnet explore to connect to my local blockchain explorer. And if I paste in this transaction ID, I can see this is an app call. And what ended up happening, if I come down in here and take a look at my global state, I can see here, this is the value. So if I just come to a base64 decode, take a look at what that is. This is a proposal. Okay, perfect. So in other words, what we had hard-coded here is what was passed to create DAO when we ultimately called it here. So now what we want to do is I no longer want to pass a value from this component. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. I'm going to delete this. And now you're probably wondering, where is the proposal coming from, if not from our app.tsx? And what we're going to do is we're just going to define a input element directly in this component itself. So we're going to come down to our render here, or our return, and you can see here it returns a single button, and that's this create DAO button. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to return a div that contains both a button and a input. I'm going to pause the video for 1 second. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. Just had to fix my settings here so I could get auto format on save back. Again, just come into your settings JSON and make sure you have format on save true and fix ESLint true into your settings if you like auto format. I personally always use it, so that's what I'm using here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to have a div that's going to have an input and a button. So this input is going to be where we eventually type our proposal. So I'm going to say input type is going to be text, and our class name, because we're using Daisy UI, I'm going to say it's input and input bordered, and I'm going to give it a margin of 2. Okay. So now we can see by having this component render not only our button, but our input, we have this input box and now our create DAO button. So what we want to do is basically set it so whatever is typed here is what's passed in to our proposal. Our method as our proposal argument. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create a new state that saves our proposal. So I'm going to say proposal, set proposal, and that's going to be use state string. Oh, excuse me. That's just going to be an empty string by default. So for those that aren't familiar with React, what we're basically doing is we're creating a variable called proposal, and we're going to allow this variable to be updated through this set proposal function. And whenever we call set proposal, any component that depends on the proposal variable is going to be updated, right? So in other words, this proposal value is always going to be the value that we most recently called set proposal with. So we now are passing in a proposal, but by default, it's just going to be an empty string. So the question is, how do we update the value of proposal when we type here? And what we're going to do is we're going to come to our input. So in here, in our input element, we're going to say on change, and we're going to define a function. It's going to take an event. I'm just going to call it E. And I'm going to say, I'm going to do two things. Well, first, I'm just going to, actually, before I do anything, let me just show you. I do console.log e.current target value. Anytime this field changes, so whether I'm typing letters, I'm cutting letters, or I'm pasting letters, it's going to trigger this onChange function, and we can get the value of our current element by calling the event.currentTarget.value. Okay, so instead of logging it, what we actually want to do is we're going to call set proposal. So now whatever we type in here, React is going to call set proposal and pass in the value we've typed in. So our proposal value that we pass here is going to match what we typed in. So I'm going to say, this is my custom proposal. Actually, I'll probably need to refresh. I'm going to say, this is my custom proposal. I'm going to go ahead and create the DAO. And we can now copy over this transaction ID, come back to DAppFlow, paste in the address. We can see our global state delta, it's no longer. And if we decode this base 64, we can see this is my custom proposal. Excuse me, went to the wrong place. So now if we come take a look back, what we've basically done is we've added this use state call to define our proposal rather than passing it in through our props. Pass in the proposal use state variable as an argument to our function call, and then added a text input element. And anytime that text input element changes, we call set proposal, passing in the current value that is populating this text field. Now, one other thing we want to do while we're here modifying our create application is we're going to also bootstrap our contract. So if you remember, we have one create method and then a bootstrap method that mints our DAO token. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call await props.typed client, and I'm going to call the bootstrap method. Now, if we remember, this is why it's useful to write tests. If we come back to our TEALScript test here, we can see, where's bootstrap? We can see that we needed to fund the account and we needed to call bootstrap with a double fee. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. So let me first update this. So we're going to do send params. We're going to set our fee, algo kit. I forgot to import it, that's why. Import star as algo kit from algo kit utils. It's going to be algo kit dot microalgos, say 2000. Let me just put this on its own line here so it's a little bit easier to read. Okay, and so we're going to call bootstrap, but before we do that, because it's creating an asset, we also need to do props type client dot app client dot fund app account. And here we're going to pass in our sender and set our amount equal to algokit dot microalgos 200,000. Again, let me bring this onto its own line so it's easy to read. And I forgot one thing I also need to do here is define the sender as well. And add my column. Okay, so in addition to adding the input, what we've also done is we've modified it. So we're going to fund the app and then bootstrap it and do with this all once we click create DAO. So this is my custom proposal. Oh, it's not gonna work because we already created it. So let me refresh. This is another proposal. I'm gonna create the DAO. We'll have one transaction to actually create it. We'll have another transaction to fund it. And then we'll have one last transaction to actually bootstrap it. And now at this point, if we go ahead and we copy the transaction ID, let's actually take a look at the application. We can now see that we have our proposal, but we also have a registered ASA ID. And if we take a look at that, we can see this is our registration asset that we've minted 1,000 of. So just as a reminder, what our bootstrap method does, let's take a look at that. We can see here that when we call bootstrap, we create an asset which has a supply of 1,000. And that is exactly what we saw just now on our local explorer. So what we've done in this video is we have modified our DAO Create application component to take in a text input for its proposal by deleting the proposal property, creating a use state value, passing it to our function, and then setting proposal based on the value of our input text field here. And then we've also gone ahead and funded it and bootstrapped our app so it can mint so it can go ahead and mint the ASA. Okay, so at this point, that concludes everything we're going to be covering in this video. And let me just check. I honestly forget what we're going to do in the next video. So right, in the next video, what we're going to do is we are going to allow, so right now, as you saw, if I try to create this again, it's going to go ahead and, fail. And it's going to not let me do another create. And so what we basically want to do is we want the app.tsx to basically know when the app has already been created and when this should be rendered or not. So again, if you're familiar with React, you can probably think about how you want to use props and use state in order to pass the application ID and set it that way. However, we're going to be going over those steps in the next video. So I'll see you then.